Welcome to the Wisdom Check by Tabletop to Keyboard. This is going to be our bi-weekly podcast where we discuss things such as Dungeons and Dragons. Actually, I think maybe we need to turn up my mic a little bit, guys. How about some more game?
This is the intro to end all intros. Talk about Dungeons, Dragons, and
Now, I don't think that's proper. This is a family show after all. This is the intro we can use, fellas. It's good, clean fun for everyone. Welcome to the Wisdom Check, where we have wholesome conversations about the dilemmas we face every day.
Nah, hold on a second. I got your intro right here. Yeah, that's better. Welcome to the Wisdom Check. Well, I'm right, just wrong. We're gonna have guests on to talk about it. It's gonna be awesome. Because I said so.
He is right. He did say so. I don't know. Is surf music the best music for a podcast about D&D?
Fuck yeah.
Okay.
This just in, nobody can agree on our intro for this podcast. So we're just going to start. Welcome to the Wisdom Check. Roll for initiative. Fuck. A 1. It's like every time.
All right, everyone. Welcome to this week's Wisdom Check. I am Dustin. With me over there is Jeff. And today joining us is JBrews. Hello, JBrews. Say hi to the crowd.
Hello, crowd.
Hey, guys. Good to see you. Thanks for coming out. So, we've got some getting to know yous to do. So, JBrews comes to us. We've seen him in chat quite a bit, hanging out in there, keeping us company on the videos. So, what kind of brought you in? What was the hook?
So I know Dustin here for quite some time now, and he gave me the heads up for the channel, and I've sort of been lurking sort of ever since. But just more recently, just been sort of chit-chatting with the people in the chat, and it's been a good time.
Awesome. And have you been gamer for a long time, or is this kind of a newer hobby for you?
Tabletop has been probably going on 8 years now.
Nice.
But gaming, it's been pretty much came out of the womb with a Game Boy in my hand. So
Perfect. And what kind of games do you think you gravitate to the most?
Tabletop definitely more often, especially the role-playing aspect. Of that, my favorite would be Shadowrun, specifically 5th edition, but I've dabbled in a little bit of 4th. And then been doing quite a bit of research on the 6th edition one as well.
That's fantastic. And I know for our group, we really haven't done a whole lot of Shadowrun, but I've definitely played it with some other people before. And for those of you in the audience who maybe haven't seen Shadowrun, it's a cyberpunk kind of setting. And by kind of, I mean, it absolutely is cyberpunk. And it's kind of that edgy, like, I don't know, what would you say, like 80, like it's not set in the 80s, but it's got that kind of vibe a little bit to it. And it's a combination like magic and orcs and elves and stuff with cyber technology and hacking and, mega corporations, and it's just brutal.
I would be real interested to see how they've updated that over the editions, because it was very set like in the 80s when it first came out. It seemed like that was like the quote unquote like future tech at the time, the cyber samurai and all that sort of stuff. Like it'd be interesting now, like, yeah, street samurais, that's what they're called. But 20 years later, like how they've updated the game with the new edition would be pretty interesting to actually look at. I know before you were doing your Shadowrun on your channel, you were also running Starfinder.
Yes, that is true.
Which is like space Pathfinder for people who haven't seen it. It's D&D in space. It's kind of interesting. I was kind of getting into that game, and then it seemed like it kind of abruptly ended for you guys. Did you just decide screw it, or were you?
We had a lot of people that as role-playing games are, you have a lot of scheduling issues, and people were moving, and with the moving, either they got new jobs and could become available, or now they had an extremely long trip they had to make back and forth, so they became a bit unavailable after that. Unfortunately, we sort of just had to break it off because we're having 2 people out of the 5 cast members show up. So we sort of had to go ahead and take some of the same people, but then also revamp it a little bit. And Shadowrun works a little bit better with the smaller group of people compared to Starfinder, who works better with the 4 or 5 amount of people. So,
and I got some guesses why that may be, but for the audience, since I don't know, I'm assuming most people haven't played Shadowrun, but the general layout of Shadowrun. I mean, I guess I can interject here, but you've been playing, so why don't you tell us about kind of the structure of it and why it kind of works for that smaller group as kind of picking up and getting going.
Yeah, so I will say it has a little bit higher barrier to entry compared to other editions, but it's sort of in 3 steps. You have the late works, or the pre-run, where you do all your research, your recon, and stuff like that, and then you come up with a plan. And then the next step is sort of, hey, I have my specific set of skills that I will do on this run, and then that will hopefully get us to success where we don't have to fight, because Shadowrun is very, very dangerous. You take one bullet, you possibly die. Time to roll up a new character. But then you have the last where it's like, oh, I did the job, now we're going to go ahead and get paid, and sort of just do the turn-in part of the run. And then that's really all Shadowrun is, and then just doing it over and over again and throwing it into a campaign if you want.
Very, very quest-based. It's like running like quest in video games. Very quest-based, the way that it's laid out.
Very much so. You still have the overlining plot of it, but a lot of it's a lot of pick and choose moments in it. And then you sort of just do runs and then have open amounts of time where characters can develop using their sort of experience points for it. And then you go back into another run type thing.
Now, we only dabbled in it like 20 years ago. When I say dabbled, I mean I made 2 characters and played 1 game session. That's my Shadowrun experience, just so you got an idea where I'm coming from here. And that was like 4 editions ago. So on a level of how much crunch and mechanics there is to the game. Now, combat's very, very heavy mechanics, if I remember correctly, like heavy mechanics.
I think actually combat's a little bit sort of the easier now. It's a lot of floating modifiers, but if you play 3rd edition or 3.5 D&D, most people are very comfortable with the floating. But it's a lot of like the matrix stuff and the hacking that can sort of drag the game along if you do rule by rule. But when it comes to like matrix and stuff like that, I try to keep it short so that way everyone at the table is not waiting 30 minutes while the hacker tries to do their one thing to get this one piece of information that may or may not be helpful 3 missions down the road.
I just remember like cascading initiative, where it was like if you had an initiative of like 27, you went every 10. So you went at 27, 17, and 7. It was like, depending on how high you could pump that initiative, you could take a lot of attacks around. And like you said, it's a game where like 1 strike, boom, that's it. You could be dead. So it was like extremely lethal, like very lethal.
Yeah, and the initiative's still like that, but I know in 6th edition they are switching it up a little bit, and they're doing sort of like the D&D rules for it, where you still roll the X amount of D6 plus your initiative, but now it's just like it's stagnant, where you just, if you have a 26, you have a 26, and it just keeps rotating around.
Okay.
So that'll cut down on a little bit of that.
Yeah, and the new edition's coming down to crunch quite a bit. It's sort of becoming like the 5th edition is a 3.5 in D&D terms.
Interesting. So in our chat over here, does anyone have any experience playing either of these 2 game systems, Shadowrun in particular?
Do we have any Shadowrun players out there?
It'd be fascinating to find out, because it definitely had a super niche audience, but that niche was very just like robust, Yeah. And the game type, just kind of elaborate on it. It is all about, okay, so BizLab's played.
BizLab's, he's got
so. Let's see, sounds cool, but
except there's first edition to current, so he's played all the editions too. So
yeah, so like the setup for it is basically mercenary groups, and you get contracts from people within these megacorps, essentially, usually through some kind of seedy back alley guy that's your fence rather, and who knows what the job actually entails. Like usually it's super, cloak and dagger. It could be like picking up some, merchandise, getting espionage on another company or whatever. But the companies actually kind of took the place of governments, and it's just brutal, so like really gray areas moral wise. It's pretty fascinating. It's
pretty seedy. It's kind of it's a very seedy underworldish kind of game. It's got, like, I hate to use it as an example, it's kind of got the World of Darkness sort of undertones to it. Only it's more cybernetic. Like I said, you get basically half the party's usually cyborgs of some sort, like at varying degrees and levels.
Now, both systems that you were playing are kind of future-based. Is that something that you find yourself gravitating towards more so than fantasy?
Oh, I've played D&D since 3.5, and then once 5th edition came out for D&D, I had a session or 2 sessions every week till above probably about a year ago. So I just felt like I played a lot of D&D, and I wanted something a little new. And then Shadowrun sort of caught my attention, and I really like the futuristic terms with that. And then I'm always just any sort of space things just always blew my mind. So it seems like Starfinder was the next best thing because it still had the crunch like 5th edition did. But I think those are really the main reasons why I like Starfinder and Shadowrun, because it has more of that crunch to it compared to D&D, which is more has less crunch to it. So.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing. I mean, the system definitely kind of favors more crunchiness, but as we kind of talked about in the past, role play seems to be pretty system independent. Like you can role play your heart out, regardless if there are rules, no rules, extreme amounts of rules. And that's it's kind of a neat thing about it. If you got a group that's into the kind of the crunchier games, Shadowrun probably is your jam, especially if you like that more simulationist style where, getting shot is bad. Don't get shot, Right. And, it's fascinating kind of getting kind of into this sort of thing. We were talking earlier about the, I can't remember what they're called. The deckers? Is that the hackers that go into
the deckers.
Cyberware? So like, the issue with that in the past that I've seen, as you kind of described, is that one dude goes in, plugs into the computer and starts dealing with a whole world that nobody else gets to interact with. And this kind of gets us into this concept of pacing. Now, I know we were talking about pacing in terms of storyline, but it also kind of plays into it in the kind of give and take of a particular game session. Now, have you found any particular elements of Shadowrun that kind of, other than decking, that kind of like naturally phrase that a little bit, makes it a little harder?
Yeah, really with the 3 different, what I like to call scenes for each run, sort of each archetype or class that the game comes with sort of takes over a moment of that. So like the beginning or the intro part of it, anyone who's going to have like really high charisma is going to be really well because you're going to be talking about trying to get more money for your group or have more contacts overall so you can try to reach out to more people. But you also have like the decker who's going to go try to hack everything first and then get Ella's access. So when he comes back, he's like, hey, I don't have to worry about trying to hack through 40 firewalls to get to this door I want to open for you guys. And then you have the middle part where if everything goes sideways, you have the 3 Sams who's like, oh, I'm going to be really, really good at this compared to the people who are talking like, well, you go do that. I'm going to go sit in the car. But so each phase sort of has different people who sort of shine compared to others. And when I usually do character creation with my people, I try to have them have like a second job where they were really good at talking. But, if they get into a gunfight, it's not the worst thing because they still have something they can do for it. So just trying to find that balance of, just you're the best at one thing, but you got some skills in another area where you can be backup if needed. So you don't feel like you're ever just sitting for a whole session waiting for something to happen.
Yeah, definitely. Now, the type of games that we get out of this, though, for the Shadowrun, it definitely seems like kind of self-contained episodes. Do you find in your games for Shadowrun that it's there is a lot of room for an overarching plot, or does it feel like it's not really part of the game?
I think it could go either way because with Shadowrun, which is interesting, it does already have like the books already have an overarching plot as the editions go on that sort of tell the story more and more. So the arc is definitely already there. And then it's sort of up to DM's discretion whether you want to actually include that or just have that just be off happening elsewhere in the world.
Gotcha.
I like to try to tie it into the campaign. It makes it feel like the characters are actually part of it compared to just living in this world. They sort of know, hey, I'm actually in this for the run type thing.
Absolutely. Now, it looks like we got a little chat there. Plague State, what are you talking about over there, Dustin?
I saw up here was talking about a couple other games where we were talking about how combat typically decreases the amount of combat you do, the more lethal a game is. And we kind of talked a little bit about this last week. Like when you have a game where, like you said, one bullet or one slash from a weapon will drop you, you get real hesitant about deciding to walk in there guns a-blazing and just start crap. So what happens is you find yourself role-playing a lot more. You find yourself using the hacking, the charisma, a lot of these other sorts of things going on. So he was, Byside was actually pointing out a few other systems. He says they're Chameleon Eclectic. It was back in the 90s, another system he says that does a lot of that. He just put up a link there for it. You can actually go check it out.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I always push for this in the LARP setting.
Oh, yeah,
that we should make the combat more lethal, get rid of defensive abilities a little bit that were a little overpowered to promote more role playing, because the threat of violence is what you want. You want that edginess, that kind of risk factor and stuff. The actual results of violence typically, and then the actual fights typically derail story a little bit and interaction.
It was always harder in LARP because there were so many players and so few STs. So like STs didn't have the level of control you have at the table, like as a DM would have. Like when there's 50 people walking around a building and then one decides to up and kill another for either good or bad reason. Like as an ST, then you get pulled in and it's already, you can't deter it like you can at the table. So making a lethal system in LARP was always the pushback, was like when you have 4 or 5 out of 50 who are the asshole players that are going to do something like that. Like you got to be careful what you're unleashing on everybody else. But yeah, I was always a bigger fan of having it more lethal, but I definitely think at the table you can do it because the DM has more control with 5 people at a table than 50 people in a building.
For sure.
So, JBrews, aside from your Shadowrun and Starfinder, you're also playing regularly with Mod 20, correct?
That's correct. I actually just took over as DM for Mod 20 Gaming. Allowed the DM some time because he's been doing it for quite some time, and he wanted to try to just take a seat back and be a player for a little bit. So he asked me if I would mind stepping in as a GM for him. So,
and what are you running there?
Well, so the group has been running for 2 years on D&D 5th edition, and they were looking for something, just something different. I work a lot with Mod 20 Gaming, so they're like, hey, what about the Starfinder or Shadowrun game that you run weekly on your show? Like, what can you go ahead and describe it? And I went through and described sort of like each of the roles and what they do and stuff like that. So they asked me if I would run Shadowrun for them. So starting Friday,
so you're going to be running that there too?
Yes, it'll be my 3rd game that I run pretty much weekly. So.
Wow, that's up to 3 games a week. That's a lot.
Yeah.
Kidding, man.
2 of them are streamed, but one is done over like play by text. So you sort of just go back and forth through conversation through text message. It's a little bit slower paced, but it allows people to play the game that a lot of times they wouldn't have the opportunity to because they can't have the opportunity to sit down at a table. So.
I really did not expect that to come up in the topic tonight, but that is a style of game that does exist. It used to be, I think, fairly popular, back in the day. I mean, I guess kind of like the chess, like you send the little, like, this is my move here, and you analyze it to death. And then you in this case, you can like come up with your perfect reply, and like add the flair of the, descriptive words and everything and set the scene.
Well, there's some variation in there too. I'm on another Discord, and I can't remember the name of it here off the top of my head. If I look over here, maybe I can find it. I think it's Tabletop Podcasting I had joined, where they actually have different chat channels on there that one specific night of the week at a certain time, they all get on there and they play through a game. They put their roles on there, everything. It's all done through Discord. And they actually play entire sessions this way. Now, as far as that goes, as far as like our topic of like pacing, like I don't know how you pace that. Mm-hmm. Like I don't know how you DM that. Like that to me, it blows my mind. Like I don't participate in it, but I can go in there and click on the chat and look at like what happened, and I'm like, I don't know how you run that. Like that's like a whole different style of gaming that I don't know how to do, to be honest.
It definitely took some practice. I one of the Discord here as well. That's Shadowrun based, and it's usually just an RP server. So you just go to like a bar or something like that and use RP, just back and forth conversations. But I sort of saw that as an opportunity. It's like, what if you didn't have a mic or you didn't have these different things that you were able to sit up on Roll20 or whatever and actually just walk through these things? So what if we just did combat like this? It's a little bit slower, but what I do is go ahead and give everyone sort of a chance to do what they want to do. But like the story's progressing too far with one player, sort of just sitting in the back. I sort of just wait, make sure to reach out to that person, like, hey, I'm getting ready to move the story on to the next area. Or is that okay? Or is there anything you want to do prior to that? And it was a conversation that we had with the players before starting. It's like, hey, this is sort of what we're going to be doing, and this is how I'm going to run it type thing. So it seems to be working really well. We almost have completed our first run. It took about 3 weeks of just on and off texting. So it takes a lot. It takes longer, but I mean, it's a way to play the game that you enjoy.
Now, for your in-person games that you're streaming, do you get a lot of character background for your players, and like how you weave those into your overarching story, or do you have more of a DM narrative that you?
A little bit of both. I tried to go ahead and give my players, sit down with them, have like a little session 0 individually, sort of see what their character, if they have any skeletons in the closet they don't want to share with the group before going into character creation. Right. And try to see exactly how they want to build the character, how they want to play the character. And then I try to go ahead and drop little breadcrumbs along the way to give those opportunities to really have that character growth as the team becomes more of a team. But I guess Shadowrun's a little different to go ahead and have all that specialization going into it, where it's like very combat heavy at times, or very like I'm having a professional conversation with me and the Mr. Johnson, which is the person who gives you the runs. So it has those. It's difficult, but it's not impossible to do.
See, to me, that's what really affects the pacing of a story. Whether you're doing Shadowrun, D&D, 5th Ed, anything else, it's the combats, in my opinion, that are the bookmarks for how your pacing is going. Like if you're rushing from one combat into the next, you're going to seem, even though those combats are 10 minutes worth of your player character's life, they're hours of your life. And so the game seems like it gets nowhere. You know what I mean? Like, so to me, it's always finding that balance between I don't want to call it downtime, because it's not downtime necessarily. You could be working on non-combat related things, and it's not downtime in my opinion. Like, because you're not just putting in a side scene for the sake of a side scene.
Right.
But there is role play probably going on, and maybe they're working on important stuff, but it's not combat. There's not immediate threat. And then there's the times when there is immediate threat, and those things can be choppy if not handled correctly. If you let the role play scenes go on too long without combat, then you lose a little bit of your energy sometimes. If you have too many combats, not enough role play, then people don't know what's going on. It's just been killing stuff for what seems like a week. And you got nowhere. Like, and everyone stops is like, I forgot why we're here. Like, so.
Well, and that's the thing. I think it's consistent with TV shows, movies, and that kind of stuff, is they had like a rule of like every so many minutes there had to be an action beat, right? And I feel compelled to do that whenever I run a game. Like, oh, it's been like a game since I had a combat. Well, okay, I'll throw something in. But I think really, realistically, you should be pointing at just making the meat and potatoes of your story the setup for why a fight or an encounter may occur. And then if you have it, great. If not, just the threat of it should be pretty good. Like the Shadowrun example, the threat of violence gives you that action beat. But yeah, it's really easy to screw that balance up, and throw in too many fights or leave too much space in between. And I don't know, I guess it depends on your group and like what they're willing to tolerate, what they enjoy in the game, and how you can thread things together consistently.
And I think a lot of that's important of sitting down, having that conversation is like, hey, and I try to do this every so often with my players. So we'll go on 2 or 3 runs, and then I'll go ahead and be like, so how is the pacing for you guys? How is this? Is there too much combat? Is there not enough combat? Just trying to see how the characters feel, because even people, as you play more and more role-playing games, you start seeing, okay, so I used to be a murder hobo, but now I'm actually starting to enjoy the actual mechanics and roleplay part of this. So less would be great or something like that. So I always try to keep up with my players and just try to see exactly how they're feeling about certain sessions and stuff like that.
Yeah. Now, Dustin, when you run games, you usually have kind of a set arc that you have kind of planned out ahead of time.
I do.
You have like kind of chapters outlined. You have kind of an idea of where things are going when and like what order.
I try to stay about 1 chapter ahead of my players, just so I have an idea of where, especially when I'm dealing with Roll20, because like I said, with the previous, like the map making and everything, like you got to kind of have an idea where you're going. But yeah, no, for sure.
Now, technology with outside of this, so let's take out the Roll20 aspect of it. Just in terms of writing a story, how much emphasis do you put on the action beats as opposed to more of the characters and like what they're doing?
I try to think of mine like it's not as structured as what he says Shadowrun is, where it's like you scope out, do mission, come back. Like for me, I tried to emphasize all the different parts of the character sheet. So for me, sometimes my action beats aren't combat related. I'm a big fan of combat maps that are not combat, I like to call them objective based combats. There might be some fighting going on in it, but the idea is not to wipe the board clean. It's not like a chess match where you have to like capture the king or anything like that, but like just more something on the map needs done. And if you can get those things done and get out, the amount of combat you do is based on the die rolls that happen. So I put a lot of action beats in mine. And then I try to, when those things are done, give some resolution and some time for the players to process what just happened and what's going to happen to them next in usually a less combat situation or less stakes situation.
Sorry, I was getting distracted by a cute cat suddenly appearing out of nowhere.
I saw that you had.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. We hear Twitch cats are good for ratings. So
that's why I constantly have one at the desk get ready.
That was our action beat for this scene.
Exactly.
Yeah, so non-combat but action in the sense of there is something dramatic occurring that could have consequence. Like, because I think you can have a action beat in a purely social scenario as well. If you have a very pivotal negotiation occurring, or like an awkward conversation that has to come up, something that's like character defining, I think those can be strong substitutes for a fight. You guys agree?
They can be. I think it has a lot to do with how you structure those social things. Do you have a situation like that, JBrews, where I don't know how the social stuff works in Shadowrun as well? Like, is it?
Yes and no. Obviously, there are people that have like the charisma, like the what they call the face. Those people seem to be more invested in the social aspects of it. And then people who have certain knowledge skills about, like, crime bosses. Most people just see like, okay, it's cool. Some guy sitting on a throne in the middle of the room, no big deal. But someone's like, no, this guy's the big wig here in Seattle. Like, this guy will mess all of us up. And that's sort of how my players sort of see those social situations. Like, yeah, they realize one person will realize what the actual threat in the room is, and then the rest of the players will see how this one person's reacting and be like, oh, we need to sort of back up and actually keep our head level type thing. I'm not sure exactly what you were talking about, but that's sort of how Shadowrun sort of works with the social encounters and like dropping the action beats.
It just occurred to me that Shadowrun is literally the A team.
Yeah.
More or less.
That's literally how it works.
More or less.
It literally is like episodes of the A team, right? Like literally that's where they get the name Face from, isn't it? Is it that the guy on the A team who does all the charisma
I
stuff?
think so, yeah. Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, I think you can have those interesting scenes though, like what you're talking about with the the important person in the scene. Like maybe like you have a Shadowrun that your job is to go pick up some espionage on a company, you're stealing like a prototype or something and getting it out, and then you run into another Shadowrun team out there. They're doing some other mission involving that same object, and you start to get in some questionable discussions suddenly. Like, what are we doing here? Are we throwing down? Are we negotiating what we want to do with this? Are we discussing the ramifications of which one of our runs is going to be better for each of us? Like there's a lot of things in tension that can get ratcheted up there even without the combat. So I can see that being kind of like just a hair on the back of your neck kind of standing up, knowing that there's not necessarily violence coming, but just things are not necessarily going how you intended them to.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing, and really like any role-playing game aspect, as long as depending obviously on your players, but just the threat, like you were saying, of something going sideways and just being absolutely horrible for either your job or just your character in general, it's just always that threat of people actually being cognizant of that, I think is a huge thing.
yeah, I think for sure, like I think, like I said, when you're dealing with social situations, I think if you're going to use a social beat as an action beat, I think it's, like I said, it's important that once you ratchet up the tension, whether you're doing it through physical actions or social actions, you have to make sure that you have that decompression time afterwards. Like, I think that you can't get confused as a DM and think that because you did something socially, that if you made it tense and social, it's not time for the players to digest everything, talk amongst each other. They can't do that in the presence of that NPC. Like, in my current live game I'm running, and if any of those players are watching, they're going to know what's going to happen on this coming Sunday when I run again.
Spoiler alert!
Spoiler alert for my live players if they're here. They're not. Don't worry. But they had a confrontation in the slums of this town, and there were 4 different groups represented, and it was a crossway fight between 4 groups, the player group being one of them, and I ran 3 other groups in what I can only call Rumble in the Bronx. So in the midst of this whole rumble over all this stuff going on, one of them got downed. They eventually get saved by the city guard, who's one of the other factions that comes in. They pick them all up. Well, this investigator they had talked to and they didn't want to give any information to now has them in captivity, basically, and is gonna. So they had this big, huge action sequence, and now they're gonna get this time where they talk to this inspector. I can't count that, however, as decompression time. One guy's still out cold. The other 3 are in chains. They're gonna have a social scene with this inspector, but it's not a scene that's gonna be light. It's not a scene that's gonna be fun, like, in that regard. So once they get out from this guy one way or another, like, I got to give them a chance to meet back up somewhere, and go through that, what the hell just happened, like, what are we going to do next time, like, and give them that time to figure out what they're going to do instead of running them into another combat immediately.
And like you were saying, I think it's extremely important. As when I first started DMing, I was like, action, because these are what makes the game fun, right? Having that downtime to actually sit down and have your character just understand what just happened is such a huge, huge thing that I wish I knew like 7 years ago when I first started. No, I think it's absolutely a huge thing that a lot of people take for granted or just don't put in their games. That is a huge thing.
Yeah, I think it's super important. For one, you get to have the characters interact with each other, develop some kind of rapport. You get to see what the characters paid attention to in the scene. And then you also get to pay attention to what the players paid attention to. So as a DM, you get 2 forms of feedback immediately. And, I think for DMs or GMs or STs or whatever you want to label yourself as the person running the game, there's a kind of an urge to kind of, like you said, push another action beat out because you're feeling a lull in the energy. But it's a skill you have to kind of pick up on, and like, are my players bored and just talking to fill the space, or are they doing important work of trying to understand the setting and their characters interactions with the world? Like, that's one thing I'm really hoping we get to do this next game we get.
I think we will. And I think it's important, too, as somebody who's putting your game out there in a format for people to consume, that your viewers want that also. Like, I think sometimes there's this misperception that the viewers just want to see action. And that's not really true. They more and more I see out there as I go through various different channels, what people are out there really wanting to see is they're wanting to see character. Like, they really get into 1 or 2 characters for each show that they watch. Like, those are the characters that they follow, and they really do grasp it. Like, they may not get into every character on every show they watch, but they definitely want to see those character arcs develop, and they want to see those things happen so that the combats have meaning. And that's what I see that people really want. So I think if you're out there, anyone who may be watching this on YouTube later or anything else, if you're planning on putting your game out there on YouTube or on Twitch or DLive or wherever you're putting it, like, just remember that those beats are important because people need that time as viewers, not just your players, but the viewers need it also.
Now, you watch some shows, JBrews. So, like, what do you find yourself kind of gravitating towards? Like, when are you interested in a stream?
So, like you said, I'm one of those characters, or one of the people that really enjoy the characters more than the combat or the puzzles or anything going on like that. But the story itself, and then how each character grows, I think is what I pull myself towards the most. So seeing how each player sort of sits down and reacts to either like a big explosion that happens or someone that they knew passed away or something like that, see how that character deals with that, I think is something that I enjoy more than seeing a whole episode worth of combat. Just that one moment I think I'd rather have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's generally where I'm at as well. Now, I enjoy a combat here and there, but I definitely think what people are attracted to in that element is the drama. And I think drama is only there if you, like Dustin was saying, and what you've been saying, if you're invested in those characters. And you can only get invested if they get time to, develop. So it's, let's see what's the chat saying. We're getting a little activity down there.
Yeah, I was going to, as soon as you were done here, I was going to say what Two Socks is saying here. He's saying that it's all about characters of those good RP sessions. He says, but good characters in combat can be just as entertaining if done right. And that was something I was actually going to get to in a minute. I would love to do another wisdom check on this at some point, and I think we probably will, is how to role play in combat. Like, we kind of touched on a little bit with Naravi a couple weeks ago, but like, I would like to do just a full segment on just how to role play in combat, because people don't do it enough. And I think so much of that good role play that you have in your scene, you move into combat, so much of it gets lost by so many people because they quit role playing. The moment they get into combat, they start thinking mechanically like a robot. And that's the part that I would like to see more of out there in the world, to be honest.
Well, honestly, we don't have to be robotic and stick to our topics here.
It's true, we don't, but
we could make topic number 2.
Yeah, we could.
How to role play in combat. Kind of goes nicely with the pacing conversation here. Let's see. Crazy Ike saying we tend to get bogged down in numbers. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's kind of an artifact of how we used to play, though. I think when you're in person, like we've talked about a lot of times, there's a lot of chance to kind of do table talk and interact while the DM's interacting with certain people, or people are taking their turns and that kind of stuff. So it's not as, not as blocked into time of just pure combat. Whereas when we're doing these streams and on Roll20, when we're trying not to step on each other, I definitely feel like we do just get stuck in what the dice are saying, what the modifiers are, okay, who's talking clearly, and it's a lot harder to get those non-combat beats, non-sheep beats in there.
Yeah, I just think like there's so many things you can do as a player, and like I was saying, like you can speak every round, like it's a free action, and people don't utilize it enough. Like they don't describe how they do things enough. They do things. I move here. I swing here. But you can be descriptive about it. Like, and our DM likes to do some of that description. So we kind of feed it to him, and then he adds all the fluff back in and feeds it back to us after we see the result. So if you have that kind of system set up or whatever, but like, I don't think there's anything wrong with just, as a player, just taking the reins and just doing that as you're describing these things. Like, it's something I push myself to try to do more. Like, there's more I can do to bring Bowron's personality out in combat than even what I'm doing now. And I realize it when I go back and watch our episodes. Like, I could have done so much more here, and I just didn't. Like, I started thinking too much about tactically what spell I'm going to drop where, and I just think there's so much more people can do.
For sure. I mean, do you find yourself interjecting a lot of personal character into your actions, or do you feel like that's something that's kind of missing in your game? Or do you not want to add that stuff in?
So I'm sort of like a lot of my players sort of prefer there are a few that do prefer to describe how they're doing them themselves, but a lot of times a lot of my players specifically, like to just sort of roll the dice and then have me describe what's going on as they sort of see me as a storyteller. They tell me what they want to do, but it's sort of they give it on me to describe how it's actually happening in the world type thing. And I think that's just a big conversation of how you and your DM function, or how you and your group function. So, but yeah, I try to go ahead and give them the opportunity to, if they want to describe, but if they don't feel comfortable in that yet, because I do have a couple of newbies that are new to like the role-playing aspect. But they a lot of them do like to just give me the sort of the reins for that particular part of it.
Yeah, I think when you're brand new to the game, a lot of people are kind of sitting back, not wanting to do the role play. just trying to get the hangs of what's going on, and adding description and knowing what you're allowed to do is a big part of that. So like, I think with the description stuff, a lot of people probably avoid doing it just because they don't know where that line is. If am I stepping on my DM? Am I doing something in this description that I'm not actually allowed to do mechanically? And I think a lot of people have a hard time describing something without including the result of it.
Right.
You know, and I think that's where it gets a little screwy. Like if I say like, oh, I parkour off this ceiling over here and I jump behind him and I do a stealth kill, and then you roll the dice and that doesn't actually happen. You're like, okay, well.
Right. Where what you have to do is you have to be like, I'm going to attempt to parkour off of this wall and slash this guy in the back with my sword. And then if you roll good enough to kill him, then your DM hops in. You parkour off this thing and slash right through his heart. That's great. And you're like, yeah. But you can't just say that up front. You got to wait till you see the result on that part of it. But you can always say what you attempt to do. And then, roll the die and see where it goes from there.
I agree. I think that's a big step that I notice with a lot of my players. They'll go ahead and have me narrate it, and then they were like, well, this is what I would like to do. Mm-hmm. And then more of the experienced players like, will roll the die and then sort of see it, and they're like, well, this is what I go ahead and do, but then I slip and fall off the wall I was trying to parkour off of and it land on my face. So I think it's little increments that people get into as well.
I think the key is, if you want to encourage it, if you're a DM, you can't penalize it.
Mm.
You can't ask for role play and then decide to make it extra rolls or add negative modifiers just because they're trying to express their character through their action. I think you just have to let that go and let the action be what it is, success or fail, and then just move on to the next action. Like, I think that's sometimes where it goes awry, is DMs will penalize role play, and that's got to stop if you want good role play to happen in combat.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, and I know for like a lot of social encounters, I usually, if they give me a good enough RP for it, and like actually talk to this person and like just level with them to actually be really good, bring up good points and stuff like that, I won't even ask for a die roll in general. If they just really sell it or really perform well, then I just feel like, okay, great, you pass. Or even though you did this great, unfortunately, there's just the points you brought up just wouldn't be what he was looking for. So you still fail, but I still may give you a inspiration for playing D&D or a bonus dice pool in your next whatever you do because of that. So I think it's the opposite. Instead of trying to penalize, maybe they don't succeed, but they get a bonus on something they try to do later.
There were systems like Exalted, old school Exalted, that if you described it well enough, it could give you bonus dice.
Yep.
It's like, hey, I like what you were doing so good. Here's some stunt dice. Make that shit happen. Like, I love systems like that where it's like, hey, you get descriptive, you can get up to 3 more dice to try to do it just because we like it well enough. Like, I'm all for that sort of stuff. There was, and if you look at some of the actions we had in that game, Jeff, that you ran, man, there was some incredibly descriptive combats that happened because we were trying to get those stunt dice. Like,
yeah, and it's
I'm all for encouraging
long term, right? There are scenes that happen in that game that we remember, however many years that's been ago, right?
That's a lot.
Probably been like 10 years at this point. Yeah, and I think, rewarding people and not punishing them for trying to inject some kind of spice into the thing is important, and definitely the road to make sure this happens. One area I think is kind of challenging to sort out is actually talking during combat, like you were describing.
Yeah.
Now, let's say, for instance, JBrews is like a villain character, and he's coming up at me, and I decide to start trying to talk to him, trying to convince him, trying to explain, like what's going on, trying to halt the fight, whatever. We still are in initiative rounds. So like, by the book and a lot of games, it's like, oh, it's 6 seconds. So how many words can I get in 6 seconds? Well, okay. I got to count my words. Okay. I get 12 in. Okay. Blah. Okay. And then who gets to react when? Like if this guy's deciding to respond to me, do they get to do it on their turn, or can they do it right now? It gets real weird real fast, depending on how you run that.
I mean, in like a 5th ed D&D game, they've made it simple. Mm-hmm. And using a skill as an action, you get an action on your turn. Mm-hmm. So if you're really attempting to make a social move, you're using your skill as your action. So you're going to make your roll. And just like describing your combat action, it don't matter how many words you say or what you say. You roll your die, you see if you succeed or if he's even listening to you, and then you can toss a sentence or two out there. I don't like to go down to the word count Like, okay, make sure you get this in 6 seconds, Jeff. Start talking. Oh, you're done. Cut him off. Like, I don't like that. I like to just a sentence or two. Just keep it short and kind of sweet, and it'll probably fit in time and seem right. And then if it works, and next round on his turn, he seems to want to re-engage with you in that sort of level, then maybe you drop combat, go into more social roles, and move from there. So that's how I prefer to try to do that, if that was going to be the case. Now, maybe Shadowrun isn't that clean of a way of injecting that social role into that system, but I think you can do it still.
Yeah, and it's a little bit different because the way that initiative works. So you have like initiative, the whole initiative pass, and then you have your individual character actions. And each like character action or the whole initiative. So once everyone hits 0 from subtracting down 10, that's 6 seconds. So multiple people can act within that allotted time for 6 seconds. So the way I do the same thing. I just say, hey, just if you want to go ahead and do this, you spit out what you think would be reasonable in that time. You don't have like a full blown, here's my essay, what I'm going to say in my turn. But just, give a couple points out and then make your roll. And then now they do have a thing called edge, where you can use a point of edge, and then you can have a monologue that you go ahead and go into a spiel about. And you're just sort of like taking like precautions, trying to not get in gunfire or anything, but you're just having that conversation. You're just extended conversation where you have that them, and then you still wait for them to react. But yeah, it's really just, say a few points and then wait to see how they react on their turn.
Now, what about kind of doing something a little different where people could just talk on any turn? Do you feel like that's something that should happen? Or do you think that's too convoluted for keeping track of the turn?
I have 2 fears about that, but I'll let JBrews go first.
I don't think it's the most horrible thing, especially if it's right on that fine line between combat maybe happening and maybe social encounter. But I feel like a lot of the times players take that and then they use it to metagame and to turn into, well, this is what you should do, this is what you should do, which you should do, compared to, well, this is what I'm going to do, and then I want to see what the repercussions of my actions are. It's how I sort of afraid of people butting in at any time. Otherwise, if it's like one of those social encounters, then sure, go ahead and butt in. But I think if it's more like combat's already started, I think it has a time where it can turn into a snowball of people sort of telling them how to play compared to actually just doing what you think is right.
That was fear number 1, is overcoaching. It turns in, and it's not role play anymore. Now it's coaching. Move to there, go here, do this so I can do this. Like,
right.
It's that level of coordinated that I don't want really at the table at that point. Like, it's already bad enough when you're sitting at a table that they can literally be doing that when it's neither of their people's turns. One player can turn to another while I'm dealing with the guy whose turn it is and start, he's already coaching what they ought to do next. Like, sometimes that's already going on. It's bad enough. It's bad enough when they're now injecting into the middle of someone else's turn. So to me, that diminishes role play more than it actually aids it. But
now, is that so we're talking about out of character, over the table coaching, right?
Yeah, but I think they just try to do it as their in character voice to make it in character. Like,
gotcha.
So they're doing the same thing, but now because they're doing it as role play, they can get away with it. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I don't know. I'm more okay with it in that instance, though, because at least the characters are speaking out loud in the scene, right? So, like, the villains could potentially be understanding what their battle strategy is. Hey, go over there, run behind that barrel. I'm going to shoot this. Okay, well, now we all know that. As opposed to, hey, Bill. You have fireball on your sheet, and that's exactly this area of effect right here. So go ahead and drop that on the munchkin over in the corner. Like it's a little different, in my eyes.
I see it. I think the other thing I was going to get to is that to me, when it's your turn, like that's your turn to have the spotlight. And so I feel like the more other people are directing on your turn, the less you get that spotlight, the less your character is going to shine through in that moment. So for me, like, those are things that if they really wanted to tell you that, they should have told you on their turn, or they're trying to speak ahead of their turn because their turn hasn't come yet. So now they're interjecting their stuff before their initiative. And to me, that's not the point, unless you're doing group initiative. I've seen people do group initiatives, and that's a very different story. Like if you're doing group initiative, everything is a conversation almost. Like so then it's totally cool in my opinion. But if you do an individual initiative, I don't prefer that method. I just prefer everyone to get their role play in on their turn with free social actions and just let it be what it's going to be. You know.
Now, in terms of that individual turn thing, now I totally agree with you on the spotlight conversation piece there. What I'm kind of interested in though is if the expectation was that anyone can interact on anybody's turn, then in theory the spotlight is spread evenly across the board at all times. You know,
I don't
whether or not that plays out, you know, that's a different story. But I'm kind of curious if that is a way that could work. You know,
okay. So let me ask you this, Jeff, just amongst our group, if we were going to do that in Everstorm. How much would we hear from Cameron?
As much as we hear from Cameron.
But how many more chances would we have to hear from Cameron if we were going to get him to do social actions on his turn? Like,
if we were talking directly to him, maybe more. You know, like
right. I'm just saying. Like, I think it's more likely that the two people who are the people who talk the most, like me and you, would just run roughshod over everything unintentionally, maybe. And probably do so. That's why we're on this show.
I was going to say, who would have guessed the guys with the talk show would be the ones that talk a lot?
Right.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
I think in a perfect world, it would work fine. But a lot of times we don't have that perfect world scenario. You have people that are very shy, don't want to go and talk out of turn, or maybe they think, you know, in their head it looks really cool, but on paper, I don't really have the skills to be able to do this.
Yeah.
Even though this is what you're suggesting. Now, I think that goes back to our conversation of, you know, talking while in combat, right? If you have someone who's like has a lot of military background and they're sort of just barking out orders, I think that's a little bit different to go off of. But I think it's a very specific situation, I think. But like I said, 9 times out of 10, I think it's a perfect world. It would work great. But unfortunately, we have more of like the 2 out of 10s that don't run over the rest of the group at the table.
Yeah, that's my experience at most gaming tables, and I've been at a lot of them in my time, is that there's usually 1 or 2 people that'll run roughshod over it if you let that go. But I don't mind like the idea of it, but just in practice, I don't think it would work as well. Versus just letting everyone have a chance to maybe interject some role play on their turn and not to break that idea that you're just there now doing mechanics for the next hour, 2 hours of your game life, you know.
Now, okay, so another kind of tangent here is we're talking about descriptions, right? And knowing where the edge is, what I'm allowed to, what I'm not allowed to. How much envelope pushing do you think you should give creative players? Like in Exalted, you're encouraged to say, dude, if you can describe it well, I'm going to let it happen. D&D, not so much. You know, like, do you feel like it should be there? You think like a ray of frost doesn't technically freeze anything, but used creatively, we should be able to make like little effects here and there?
I go back to like the rule of cool. Like if it sounds okay and it like plausible, like I want to shoot a fireball into the ocean. I want it to dry up the ocean. Well, that's probably not going to happen, but you can try. But I think I'm more oftentimes like, you know, I could see this working. It's a small puddle used for ray of frost. Sure, it's going to do enough cold damage that it should freeze over. But I think it goes back to, you know, if they're creative enough and like try to find creative ways around puzzles or around different encounters, I think they should be rewarded for it.
Yeah, I'm usually right along that same line. I'm more of a fan of like, let's be fair. If you're going to take your action to cast a cantrip, you need to make the cantrips about as cool as you possibly can. You know, like, I mean, what's it? Okay, because here's your other option, right? Okay, you're not going to let the guy cast his Ray of Frost to freeze a puddle. Well, you know what he's going to do instead? He'll probably take like defensive action or something and cower over in a corner. Like, how cool is that? That's not cool. That's like the most boring turn ever. Like, let him do something fun. Like, give him a chance. Like, it doesn't have to like kill the guy outright. Like, it could give him a -1 on his next attack if he slips on it. Like, he doesn't have to go prone like it was a grease spell. Like, I think that's the problem is like sometimes like people try to push the envelope too far with their stuff. So then DMs just quit doing it. So like, I think as a player, you just got to be reasonable. And then as a DM, just kind of also be reasonable. And like most of these things work out just fine. Like they're not game altering or breaking.
Yeah, I guess it's how much physics do you want to allow in your games? You know, like do I shoot some water and create some steam?
Well, we used to play with a guy that he would regularly talk about how he was going to like cleave open the dragon's stomach with one hit. And it didn't matter how much damage he did. If he didn't hit 0 hit points, he did not cleave the dragon's stomach open, right? Like round 2, nobody else is playing with the dragon's entrails, right? Like it just doesn't work that way. Like he's still got 500 more hit points. You hit him good, but that's it. Like, so you do have to like I said, play inside the box to a degree. And as long as you're not like constantly pushing the envelope, I think you'll get away with it most of the time.
Yeah, I'm kind of imagining what I do in games versus what I think I should be doing. Like I feel like I tend to go more towards the rules as written as like an individual, like because it's cut and dry. You know what you can do. People can be on the same page. There's no like gaming one another to try to get a decision out of somebody, and the turns go by faster. But the rule of cool is pretty important. Like if you can get something more more interesting out of the scene by allowing something to accomplish something that it shouldn't be able to, then maybe that's okay.
And some of the like D&D 5e spells have it written in. Like I have a water wall that says if you hit it with a cold spell, it'll freeze sections of it. Now it doesn't say how much, but I assume a 5-foot section or 10-foot section at a time. Like it doesn't specifically say that. It just says it can freeze it. So like, I mean, there's some spells that have that, make that Ray of Frost cool, man. You can do it. Like it actually will let you in some situations. So there's reason to believe it could work on something that's not a wall of water. Like,
right. I think a lot of it as well is, we make characters to be, the best vision that we have of them, right? If we have a hero, we want them to be the knight on the riding horse I'm going to save this whole village. And if we can't let a person do that doesn't say it's going to freeze something, that like you said, they're going to be cowering in the corner. And that's not exactly what they envisioned for the characters. Oh, this is all I really can do. Let those players be creative and have those special moments, because those are the moments that you remember X amount of years down the road. It was like, oh, I remember this one time this really cool thing happened because I was able to freeze over a pond or something like that. So I think it's another one of those balancing acts that we have as DMs or GMs that we just sort of have to balance with, and what's the rule of cool versus rules is written type thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, how much, obviously every topic we get into, we seem to come back to this idea of we need to have a conversation as a table. Like what do we envision? And I think a lot of times groups don't think of this topic as something to discuss ahead of time. Because I don't know we've ever really sat down and, flat out said, okay, how much do we want to bend and move around these scenes? We kind of just try it and hope it works and then feel it out for that particular session.
I think because we've been a group that's been playing together for close to 20 years or more, depending on which couple of us you're referring to, like in particular us playing with Levi, we've gotten a real good sense of where Levi will and won't let us push. So I mean, if you're me dealing with my table on Sundays where I run this live game, I don't know this guys at all. They don't know me. So right now there's very little push for either direction about what they can or can't get away with yet. They haven't really tried yet. So, but as I get a feel for them and they get a feel for me, I think I'll see more of it as we go down through the game further.
And I think a big portion as well is it's hard to have that conversation ahead of time. Like you sort of have to have someone that's like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And then when they say, well, you try this, but unfortunately it doesn't work. And then after session, like, hey, I see that you tried to do this. The envelope might have been pushed a little too far compared to what would be allowed for that. But this is something that we can maybe try to do instead. That way, if that's what your character wants to do type thing. So it's a lot of, I think, reactive afterwards. That's sort of hard to have that conversation.
Well, what I really love about what you just said and how you framed it was, no, but here's how you could do what would work.
Right.
It's okay to say no, but you don't want to just, shove the door in somebody's face. You want to give them a pathway to move forward and give them some sense of like what works in the campaign and remind them that you're encouraging them to participate, not squashing them.
Right.
I think it's really easy to screw that up.
Yeah, I agree. No, you're fine. Sorry to interrupt. But I think a lot of that as well, if you do have newer players, like with your Sunday live group that you do, sort of show them that, find a spell that one of the casters may have, like a Ray of Frost, and show them actually using that spell to do that. So, hey, you might not have thought of this, but this is sort of what you can do, and then just have them do it. And they're like, oh my goodness, I didn't know I could do stuff like this. And it just sort of opens up their eyes to it as well.
So sometimes through your NPCs, you give them hints what they can and can't get away with. Like
exactly.
Yeah, that's another kind of thing that's fascinating. Is it kind of a tangent here, but like a lot of times you get into these fantasy settings in particular, and you see, oh, the wizard creates a mage tower that has all these cool traps and like floating, pillars and stuff. And you're like, I've never been able to pull that off as a character. Like, what magic is that? I'm like level 20. I still can't do that.
Right.
LARP was the worst for that. Oh my God.
Yep.
The moment I made a super haven for that one vampire group, then every player was coming up to me. Can we make a super haven like you made for those guys? I'm like, no, you can't. You got to play by the rules. I'm the ST here. I get to play by a different set of rules. My bad guys have to be cool so that you want to come deal with them. Everybody, go back to your normal havens now, vampires. Like, don't want to hear any more of your crap.
So yeah, it's kind of weird. Sometimes there is that little double standard, I guess, that has to happen in a game. But
you have that in every game.
Mm-hmm. So it's just a matter of trying to figure out, how to show the players what they can do, and also how to highlight what is okay and what's not, at the same time.
Right. I think sometimes when you're homebrewing, if you're homebrewing and you're not using standard campaign stuff, like, you really can set more of that tone.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you're homebrewing races, if you're homebrewing monsters, like, those things intentionally are not going to necessarily play by the book.
Mm-hmm.
So I think sometimes that expectation is a little out the window. Levi throws some homebrew monster on there. Now, he throws a name monster from the DMG for the monsters manual out there. I know what that thing's supposed to be able to do. So then when it starts doing something it's supposed to, I'm like, how that works. But he throws something out there, I don't know what it is. Sky's the limit. I have no idea what I'm dealing with. And that's, I just think that you have those abilities in homebrew maybe more than you do in a setting where it's kind of more expectations already built in.
Yeah, I mean, I think a module or a pre-established world has certain lanes that you got to write in. Like once you start getting outside the box, well, you're leaving the play area. I don't know what to do from here. Whereas, fully custom game, you could probably give your players a lot more leeway. You want to get fancy and go to that town I just briefly said the name of and not go to the story. Okay, well, sure, go ahead. We'll go sort this one out. And it's a little different than the module style. I think maybe that's the same thing with the combat. Like within the module, it's kind of balanced around certain expectations. And once you start kind of getting outside of the rules a little bit, getting a little squirrely with it, those scenes maybe don't play out the way they were intended to. So I can see that being a little more tricky in those cases.
Well, I mean, I'm just beyond that. You're talking like novelizations. Like, think about playing Forgotten Realms and how many Drizzt Do'Urden novels there are, and how many things Drizzt Do'Urden has done because some author is not rolling at a table to determine what happens in that story, and then they get something in game and they come up, well, Drist's Panther was able to do this in this book, so it's canon, right? Like, this is the reason I homebrew. I don't want to deal with those kind of questions right there. Like, that's what I want to avoid.
Yeah, and that's what's sort of difficult, like about a game like Shadowrun, where pretty much the whole world is canon.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have to say a very fine line. Dragons are almost impossible to kill. There's only one that's died in all of X amount of years. But your group was like, I want to go kill a dragon. Well, good luck, because according to like the rules, not necessarily the rules, but as the lore is written and stuff like that. I mean, there's a reason why they don't have stats, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's different than if you do like a homebrew 5th edition game. It's like, oh, well, you know what? That monster doesn't have stats in the book, but don't worry, because I wrote them up real quick and created all the effects that it does.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely think you do have more freeway to do it with that in a homebrew game compared to a game like Shadowrun, where everything is chronological. I can go pull a book. It's like, hey, look, in 2077, this happened. So,
yeah, I think it's the same problem Star Wars has. Like, it's fun to watch the movie.
Yeah.
Playing the game is real tricky, because like if you're playing a Jedi, you're playing with the same group of Jedi because there's only like a handful of them.
right.
If you don't have Jedi, okay, maybe there's some stories you can have that don't brush into the main plot. But or you really have to set yourself in a different timeline almost in that game to actually have a different kind of story unfold.
That was really what the prequels did, though, was give you that place to play in. Mm-hmm. Like, the movies weren't that great, but it gave you that time when there was 1,000 of them running around doing who knew what. Like there was plenty of places you know that whole Clone Wars. And you get the Clone Wars cartoon really showed this. 1 billion planets where the wars are taking place, and 1,000 Jedi you never knew of. Suddenly you had names for by the time that 6 seasons of that series ran. So like they finally did kind of give you those areas to play in. But yeah, you can't do it in the main trilogy. There was nowhere to go with it. Like
yeah, that was definitely something I felt like I wasn't able to kind of do this kind of creative combat or the creative storytelling that I wanted to do in those settings as a player or as a game master, just because I felt locked into what that particular movie had kind of defined as, permittable, I guess.
Right. No, that's definitely for sure. You were much more limited to human element stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, and sometimes like there's other game systems coming out where some of that's going to happen now too. Like there's a new Aliens game out. Like how much lore there is for aliens. Like, so when you want to get descriptive with aliens, like it's going to be harder to do. Like, I think sometimes that's why I avoid those game systems. Like if I was going to run, like I was talking about maybe running a space game next. And so that's why I started watching your Starfinder game, because I wanted to see how it was going to play out. And so I started looking at that pretty heavily at the time because I was thinking I might do that next. And it just, because I didn't want to do Star Wars or Star Trek, either one, because there's so much lore out there on it.
And that's a big reason why I actually went Starfinder, because we even looked at Star Wars, all 3 different versions of it, but we felt like, if everyone wanted to be a Jedi, that's, again, very difficult to do with what information that we already have or lore we already have about Star Wars. Compared to Starfinder, there's no real lore other than what you create. I mean, the game's like a year old. So that's the only thing of it. There's no movies, there's no other games, there's nothing. So it really can be whatever story you want to do. So that's, I think, sort of why we went as a group towards Starfinder compared to like Star Wars or anything else like that, because it just is so open to possibilities of, this is what the planet actually looks like. And it gives you a small description in the book, but it doesn't say what, and there's no specific city in this where, you can't have this sort of thing happen. So I think that's a big reason why we went that route, because there was so much we could do with it.
So we were checking out the chat here while you were talking. Two Socks and his group over at Dadbot D&D, they've been doing Waterdeep Dragon Heist. And we were just having a little discussion here about how much time they're spending actually sitting in and role-playing for the pacing of their story has been actually pretty phenomenal. Like, I've seen a few other groups do Dragon Heist, and I can tell you that the ones that are crunchier, like they move through that thing very quickly. And it just takes you from level 1 to like level 5, I think, is where it dumps you off at. But like they can sit there entire sessions hanging out at their place just doing role play stuff, and it's not necessarily progressing through the book at any kind of pace. Like, so it's like people are, even with modules, like you can take that time and slow down the pacing of your story and like keep those things in line and allow for good role play. And those guys do a great job. So
that's fantastic. Yeah, and just to make my editing later much more difficult, we'll touch back in this part 1 of this one. The pacing story, the getting the chance for role play in the middle of things is really up to the group to kind of make that happen. I think a lot of times to kind of signal to their DM that that's what they want. Say, hey, pump the brakes for a second, let us digest a little bit, because I think, kind of going back to some of our other topics that we've talked about, the so-called meteor issue in Final Fantasy VII that you brought up countless times. While you hate the fact that the story gets paused for other things to happen, there's a certain amount of that needs to happen, for the players to have any investment in the story. I think, to kind of get into it and see what's being said.
We got a good question here from Shadzar, who's joining us. Thank you, Shadzar, for watching. He says, why are people trying to play a story instead of a game? He says, why don't you play the game, and then when it's all said and done, write an adventure about it?
That's interesting.
I think there are groups that do that.
I think so. Yeah.
I think there are some groups who absolutely do what Shadzar is talking about. Like, I don't think most groups do, but I think there are definitely some that do.
I think it kind of comes down to the type of player, maybe. So if you're into acting and character development and that kind of stuff, the game experience for you is doing that, more so than maybe the other elements. Whereas maybe just playing the game, for the X's and O's and fighting and stuff, that's not fulfilling to them in the same way. And so I think groups that are kind of built around that concept are probably going to tell the story as opposed to post-novelize it, I don't know. It's an interesting topic there.
And I think a lot of that, even if you do have, the X's and O's in playing the game, I think the downtime is part of that story, while I was doing the quest, we had this night in the tavern that we did this, and this, and this, and just had a good time being a group. So I think it can sort of be mixed in as well as, but those downtimes that you're not, fighting or something, it's still part of the story. It may not be part of the super story that you go tell your grandkids about, but it's still part of the overall grand story of it all too.
Yeah, I don't think every tabletop RPG you sit down and play, like every group story, becomes a story that would be quality enough to write like any kind of novel. Or we talked about this in previous wisdom checks, which is a good chance to say that. Shadzar, you can find previous wisdom checks on YouTube. Go to Tabletop to Keyboard, you can find them there. We talk about some of this stuff in some previous episodes. But sometimes things that make good novels or good TV shows do not necessarily equate into good tabletop sessions and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So for me, like, if you think about like video games or anything else, like they always have those cut scenes, there's lots of action, and then boom, you go back to like these, sometimes you get dialogue scenes like in Final Fantasy, games like that. They'll sit there and you have these whole scenes where the characters are just talking back and forth. And if you don't care and you're just hitting B through the whole thing, so be it. You don't care why you're there. You just want to get through and see the next cool cutscene or whatever happens, right? And I think there are groups that play tabletop that way. They go in, a lot of groups, yeah. They go in, they buy a module or something. They buy a preset dungeon from D&D Beyond or wherever DM's Guild, wherever they can get it. They plow through it, and then when they're done, they're like, "This is the story we told," and then they kind of fill in like what was all going on after the fact. And you could do that. I think for a lot of people, the journey is more important than the outcome maybe at the end. And I think for people who enjoy the journey of it, the people who aren't mashing B through the talk scenes in Final Fantasy, I think that for them that's the important part, is that what their character's doing along the way in the decision making process. So
yeah, and I think Two Socks is saying his DM notes are horrible. Yeah, go back in like a month later, you're like, chicken box go. I'm like, what the heck was I saying? Yeah, I mean, I know, Dustin, you've done a post game story a few times.
Yeah, my most
those are pretty cool. Yeah, those are pretty cool. They tell an interesting story, but they're
the reason they work. The reason they work is because I have such a strong DM narrative when I'm starting to begin with. Because I direct kind of where the game goes a little bit. Like, I don't think I fully railroad it, but I do at least kind of give a lot of good direction for players to follow to get to the next part of it. I'm able to write those at the end, and it works out better. If you were a pantser, I don't think it would work as well.
Yeah, I don't think it. Pantsers, improv, that kind of stuff, like we talked about before, probably doesn't lend itself to that style of
right
outcome.
I don't think it does.
Describing. But I find that, at least for me, I have the most fun in games when I'm having lots of choices. Like I'm making decisions. I'm coming into a scene and electing on what I want to get involved in, that kind of stuff. And that doesn't necessarily make a good, clean narrative. But it's fun. And the whole point of the table experience is fun,
Right.
So, I mean, yeah, telling the story versus just playing it and having a story told afterwards. I think if you're the type of gaming group that likes to just do modules, likes to do dungeon dives, just do the X's and O's and stuff, yeah, that's exactly the experience you're going for. But that's just not a lot of us in our gaming group, I think. You and I are pretty much on that RP side of things, I would say. Actually, a fair number of us are in our group. So I don't know. I just don't think that it's pure dungeon crawl really appeals to us the same way it may for other groups. And there's nothing wrong with that play style, of course, but it's just not our particular style.
Yeah, I think that if you're going to do that for it to be fun, you have to really ramp up the difficulty of the dungeon to really make it a challenge for experienced players. I think then it might be fun. Like I said, it's like trying to complete a marathon. Like, there's nothing fun about running 26 miles or whatever, but the point is to do it as the best you can and to make it just to finish it right. Then it's a challenge, and you made it to the top of Everest and it's done. That could be cool, but.
Yeah, Shedzar was saying, if you haven't read the chat, by the way, that in 1982, there was a game that was played and put in a magazine, and then that was later turned into an anime called Record of the Lotus Wars, which I've definitely watched. So that's interesting. It definitely felt like a Dungeons and Dragons game. And I was pretty sure that's what it was, but it's interesting to actually see that it was legit, purely done that way.
Yeah, and Shadzar's got another great point there too, and we've said this before on wisdom checks. The problem is D&D doesn't suit all things. No matter how much people want, thriller would be best maybe in a chill or Cthulhu game, and that's exactly right. You find the system that's going to tell the story you want to tell. Like that is so important. Like the stories that JBrews wants to tell in Shadowrun, he needs Shadowrun to tell those kind of stories. Now, when that creative well runs dry, he may have other good stories in mind that he can't make work in Shadowrun. He might be, what I need? I need Starfinder for this. I need Pathfinder. I need D&D. I need, you find that system that works for what you're wanting to do.
And that's what I think I like about owning so many different systems, because I don't have to be, this is the only thing that I have, so this is the only kind of stories I can write. And that's a lot of the reason why I go around and get different PDFs or get different books, so I can sort of read through the book and see what story can I create with this. Is this something I would be interested in, or is this something my players would be interested in? No, okay, well, maybe I don't have it now, but I'll have it sometime, and then pull up a different book. Okay, this is something that's new, fun, and then something that I know that my players are going to enjoy. So I'll go ahead and start writing a story about that as well.
Right. So now that we're accidentally now segue ourselves back onto track, we can actually get into what was supposed to be the second topic of the night. And that was discussing what kind of materials you think make for suitable story in game. In particular, I think the way Jeff, who had proposed this topic, was talking about more real life headline stuff being brought into game. So Jeff, why don't you kind of lead us off here a bit on where you're going with this, and we'll start throwing in our 2 cents here as you move along.
Yeah, I had some thoughts about I think one thing that people do in games is they tend to process events or aspects of their own life or world events in game form. Because we touched on this before. It's kind of a safe location to run almost like a simulation of how to process those emotions. So I wonder about things like, major disasters like huge floods. Throwing that sort of event into a game session and having your characters interact with it. Or like something like really touchy, like 9/11, for instance. And playing kind of a heroic interaction in relationship to that. Some people may feel, that it's inappropriate to bring that sort of thing into it, especially if you make it very transparent that you're wanting to explore that topic. And I'm wondering what your opinions would be on that. Is it something that you should really pursue, or should you really kind of steer clear of that?
Well, I think that this is going to go back to what we've talked about 5,000 times. It's going to talk about knowing your players a bit. I think that there are people out there who are open to processing things that may have been traumatic in their life in a game, and there are people who are not open to it. And those are there. I don't think there's a gray area. I don't think there's a lot of people who are in the middle on that. I think there are people who are perfectly okay with it, and there are people who aren't. And you just have to know who you have at your table, or know who your DM is. Like, I've seen some horror stories on Twitter about this. If you follow through on Twitter, some horror stories about things that people have done recently in games. And I'm sure there's people doing similar things in other groups, and it's gone perfectly fine. And no one ever is like, I don't understand why that was a problem. Like, so I think it has everything to do with who your group is.
And I want to use Shadowrun as an example for it, because it's sort of like in the very first 5 pages of it, it's telling you this is a horrible place. There is a lot of X, Y, and Z that does happen in the background. But I make sure to make that a disclaimer with whenever I started up Shadowrun. I gave a disclaimer, hey, this, and this are all things that are very predominantly done in this setting. Is there anything of this stuff, one, that you'd be uncomfortable with? And then a lot of times, I had an instance where someone just recently lost a family member, but I didn't know that ahead of time when I was writing the story. So in the story arc, this happened. And then I had a player come up to me, like they just said, "Hey, I have to go, whatever." We finished the session out, and then I had a conversation with them afterwards. Hey, this recently just happened to me. I can't process this on a place where I'm supposed to be having fun. So it's just sort of taking to make sure that you're listening to your players. You know, even if you don't know them or you think you know them, just make sure you're listening to your players. Asking, like, if you sort of see that the people are either awkward or something like that, just start taking that into account, taking the time to pause it. I know people are like, breaking immersion and stuff like that, but I think with these kind of situations, breaking if you can noticeably tell something is awkward or uncomfortable with the situation.
Yeah, especially if you're treading into territory and you stumble across something that triggers, like, some people when they stumble across that, like that person in your situation sounded like they handled it very responsibly. Sometimes with players you don't get that reaction. So I think that being able to read the table, if you're going to attempt something like that, you have to be able to read the table, I think. And maybe online in that kind of format's harder to do that. But if you're definitely sitting at a table, you definitely have to be able to read the table.
Yeah, one of the reasons I brought this topic up is I ran a exalted game recently, and I wrote the story like I normally do, made characters for it and everything. And then partway through the game, I started finding myself kind of not wanting to run the game. And at first I thought, okay, it's just weird scheduling, whatever. And I started breaking it back down, and I started realizing that some of the NPCs I'd written were things in my life recently that I was dealing with. And some of the plot elements I'd inadvertently kind of explored these troubling events. And I found myself just not wanting to run the game. So I ended up, killing the game off. But
you didn't trigger the players, you triggered yourself.
Yeah, it was really the weirdest trap I've ever laid for myself in gaming history. But it happens, and I kind of wonder, like sometimes people make a character for a game, and they're playing it, and they have a similar realization. They go, oh, "Okay, I don't want to play this character anymore," or maybe there's a player at the group that wants to explore a certain topic, talks to the DM, and says, "Hey, yeah, I want this to be something that happens in the game, so I can go into it." And maybe the rest of the players are kind of indifferent to it. Like, how would you script a game based on that particular situation? How would you handle that?
I think it's depending on sort of what they're wanting to do, and exactly what they're, I guess, experimenting with is the safe word for it. But if everyone's indifferent towards it, and it's not like a huge thing that might make people uncomfortable, even though they're not acknowledging that it's going to make them uncomfortable, then if no one else has an issue with it and everyone's fine with it, like openly and honestly, I don't see why not. These are supposed to be safe places where we're enjoying each other's company and stuff like that. And if someone really wants to experiment with that sort of thing, more power to you, I guess, for at least in my gaming group.
Yeah, I kind of think I agree. Like, again, it kind of goes back to who your players are. And if the players know each other well enough and they feel safe around each other to explore this topic and use a tabletop role-playing game in almost a therapy type way for them, then, so be it. If that works for them, it works for them. I think that as a player, it would be hard to do that and put that trust in the DM and other players that you're going to get what you want back out of it. And I think that the different game systems maybe lend better or worse to that. Like, I think that it would be really hard for me now in 2019 to run Vampire the way I ran it in the early 2000s. I think it'd be harder to do now because of the way Vampire Society is designed. I think you tread more heavily into those trigger type topics than you do
big time
than you would with D&D or Shadowrun even. Like, I just think the nature of that game, like it would be, and we're going to talk about Vampire in a couple of weeks, but I think it would be so hard to do that system now. Shadowzart wants to know why Vampire would be hard, and I'll tell you why. Because you have the ability to socially dominate other people, taking their will away from them in ways that, if they have had that in their life, is very quick to trigger people.
There's a lot of things that are mature themes, which really kind of comes around to a lot of domination, enslavement, abuse, especially towards ghouls. And these are themes that they intentionally delve into. And so I guess technically you've kind of signed the waiver when you play vampire that these are things that could happen. And let's see who you're saying. The Cameron 90s builds all sorts of people, then gay, female, etc.
Sure.
And that was what people liked. Yeah, I think in the time we kind of touched on this in past talks that the LARP community in particular was heavily female, like you're saying, heavily LGBTQ, particularly T, I would say. There were a lot of trans people that kind of gravitated to like the Smisi, or however you pronounce that.
Right.
I'm sure I'm going to get butchered on that one. But the that concept of being able to play in the different bodies, changing your gender and that kind of stuff. Yeah, that was definitely something that was appealing to people, even if they didn't realize why.
Yeah. And ironically, those people, of course, were the quote unquote bad guys, right? I mean,
their morality.
Those were forbidden powers, right? Like you couldn't have them. If you did, suddenly you were a Sabbat member and needed to be hunted down and destroyed.
Yeah.
I can't imagine how this could go wrong, Jeff. Tell me how this could go wrong in 2019.
Yeah, exactly.
Just saying.
It butts into some weird territory. And I guess when we get around to the Vampire Day, there's a lot of things we could talk about, especially
and we will.
Scenes I ran that I really regret nowadays, looking back on it.
But I look, all of the situations where I felt like I crossed lines I shouldn't have as an ST were almost predominantly running Vampire and World of Darkness games.
Yeah, I think it's a high wire act, to get it right. Interesting. A high population of LARP for ATM was females. Yeah,
they were. It's true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was seeing, we were talking about before, it was almost like 50-50, at least in our game.
That's true. So, like I said, I don't think you probably find yourself running into those situations as much with Shadowrun, I would imagine. You find like common day hotlines like that you're finding weaving into your Shadowrun games at all? Like
there is, because with cybernetics you can easily change your gender or do anything like that because you have the cybernetic and all this other capabilities of doing so. But racism's a topic that's always been there and will probably for a while always be here. So, it's one of those things, like there's, in Shadowrun, there's gangs that literally hate X amount of, they just hate trolls. They just do. So, again, if that's a thing that, triggers your people, then I maybe will write those people out of the story a little bit. But again, it goes back on knowing your players and just making sure that if there is things that you're aware of triggering, obviously keeping them out of the games, whether it's one thing or another.
Right.
But I think like we were saying, back even 7 years ago, I could write stuff and it'd be completely taken differently than it is taken now. But just making sure you have that disclaimer with your people, like, hey, these are the stuff that, these are the kind of world events or something else that is going to be happening in the world. Is everyone okay with that? It's going to come up at one point or another. It may not be today, it may not be next week. And if it is uncomfortable for you at that point, let me know. And then we could do something about that situation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's how you have to approach it. And something like racism is a good one, like you can think about, because that qualifies even into more mainstream like D&D.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Like you talk about, it's almost built into the system in some ways. Like in not so much in 5th Ed, I haven't seen it, but like in older editions, it was like if you were a dwarf, you got like an extra plus against goblins and orcs.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
If you were an elf, you hated the dwarves. Like it was like written in a book. Dwarves and elves don't get along. They hate each other. Like,
and I'm pretty sure it's still in 5th edition. If you read like the thing for dwarves, I'm pretty sure in the fluff it's like you don't like. You usually have hard times. Exactly.
Half orcs and you will not get along as well. Like it's in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think a lot of it as well. Older editions, you see an orc walking through town, you're going to give him side eye a little bit. I think it's just in older editions, that we taught this amount for X amount of time. But, with 5th edition, you have a lot of playable monster races that, usually you see them and people instantly hate them. Goblins, hobgoblins, furbolgs, whatever. But I think like racism and immigration stuff like that's hard to it's going to be part of the game, but I think it's written into it a lot of times. But it's just knowing what game you're signing up for, as well as what kind of game you want at your table.
Sorry to cut you up. I gotta take a quick bite. I'll be right back.
Yeah, I think that there's been other forms of media that have helped with some of that. Like you were saying, like some monster races that are player races now, like people giving the side eye, things like that. I think things like World of Warcraft have done a good job of showing how the humans and the orcs, like both sides, are both good and bad to a degree where it's like you can kind of pick and choose which humans you don't like anymore and which orcs you don't like, but you can't blanket like hate all of them like you could maybe before games like that would come out. So I think there's things like that out there that are doing a lot of good job of helping break some of that down a bit from what the old edition D&D rules were kind of written as. But if you play an older edition, if you go back and pick up an older edition, some of it's going to be in there, Like I said, there's certain races did not get along, and it's kind of expected for you to run with that to a degree. I think that what's important is that people never heavily identified any of those completely created fictional races to any actual like real races. And I think as long as you don't try to marry any of that together too closely, then you're not treading into anything that's going to be too much of an issue for somebody. Like, as long as I think you're not heavily laying on, I think that's where some people had some issue with the movie Bright. Did you watch the Netflix movie Bright?
Like 5 times.
It was, I enjoyed Bright, but I can totally see the perspective that people had where they felt like what they were doing with the orcs in that movie was too heavily related to like African American communities, things like that. So I could see like where some of the complaints came in, even though it didn't personally bother me. Like, but I think if you do something like that too heavily, I think then you can tread into dangerous territory at a table.
Right. And I can definitely see that. And I know that was a big hot topic when that movie first came out. But I think that a lot of, we play different tabletop games, and that's sort of the thing that we hate, orcs. We don't like those people. But then I think, like you said, if we have it separated and try not to put it too closely to, a certain actual race, I don't think it's a huge issue as long as we make sure to have that cut line, like you were saying.
I think what's interesting about this racing, I may be retreading on something you just said a second ago, but the notion of certain races being evil, like everybody in this race is evil, has been a sticking point in some of the community, saying like all goblins are bad guys, which seems kind of silly on one level because goblins are bad guys, but on another, it's like there is no flexibility within in a race in a game, and that kind of gets in a weird place of saying that like certain races maybe have certain built-in predispositions towards something, that is technically racism,
Yeah. Like we were saying, I think it's one thing for a D&D monster race to be in that situation because most of those races are not heavily culturally tied to any actual real life culture. Like, I think when you start to tie them, that's where you get into trouble. Yeah. And that's where we were using the movie Bright as an example. Like, Bright started to skirt that line a little bit, and some people were very uncomfortable with it. It didn't personally bother me, but of course, I'm not the kind of person who'd be bothered by that. So I watched the movie. I had no problem with it, but I could see where people did. And I think if you're doing that in your game, you could be pushing that line a bit. And I could see where some people wouldn't like it.
Yeah. And kind of touching back on the topic here of, real life events being brought into a game. Things like the X-Men we've talked about before, right? You had a story that was clearly about the civil rights movement, right? So you had Xavier being MLK, and you had, Magneto being Malcolm X, and so you had this kind of thing that you couldn't help but notice that theme, right? And like, if you ran that as a game, you're essentially running a game about the civil rights movement during the time of the civil rights being a thing. So clearly that was the intention of the comic book writers, but that could be a style of gaming as well. If you're trying to get in and, I don't know, promote some kind of activism or something, maybe you could touch on those themes in the game. but it kind of gets a little dicey still. There's a little
It can.
push and pull on that.
But I think as well as it can get a little dicey, I think it is a good way, as long as it doesn't affect anyone on that level, like on a full-blown level, then I think it gets the people involved. Because, it is something like you're saying with like an activist group or something like that. It's something that they can personally relate to that sort of grabs them into the story and, oh, well, this is something really interesting to me. Then it's sort of also, you want to get their focus, but you also get a game that they actually really, truly care about. Not, I'm going to play some games with my buddy, but this is a game or a story I really want to tell. So I think it can get dicey, but I think it also has fantastic story potential.
And those are things, again, like everything else we kind of talk about, eventually at some point or another, it goes back to that social contract at your table. Like, I think there's a difference between what you and your group are okay with, and if you're putting that out there for the world to see in video form, I think you have to be a little more selective about what you'll pick.
Yeah.
I think you have to be a little more cautious about how you might portray different things if you're putting it out there in that kind of format. But if it's, in your own home with your friends, like, and you want to explore something, you can attempt to explore it in a way that maybe you learn something valuable from it, from the experience, So I don't think it's always have to be off the table, but I would be careful about how you put it out there for sure, like, and how you go about if you're in the world of trying to attract viewers, things like that.
Yeah, and so in Shadowrun, drugs are a huge thing. You get all these different perks from them. And I actually had a person report my Twitch channel because I was promoting drugs on my channel. So it's one of those things that I sort of have to, I know that the character is doing them, but it's something that he has like an auto injector that automatically puts the drugs in his bloodstream. But so he's like, my injector activates. I know what that means. The players know what that means, but it's something that we've had to do because we've been flagged on it.
And ironically, nobody would question taking vials from the alchemist in D&D and quaffing them down for bonuses. Nobody thinks anything about it. It's basically the same mechanic. No one thinks a thing about it.
It's
all about how it's
fluff.
Yep.
Yep. And and I get there's, if they have that sort of issue, then I can completely understand that. But it's just one of those things where your audience also is, once you put it online, it's this kind of thing you have to look for.
And it's there forever.
Exactly.
Or at least on Twitch for 60 days. 60 days, unless you highlight it. So.
But
I think something. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead, Jim.
And I was going to say, what was I going to say? I just lost my brain.
I was actually trying to read some of Shedzar's comments here in the chat. He's talking about how he says here we go. He was saying that Forgotten Realms is really the only setting that kind of delved into it, into some of the race relations. And I don't know if I remember that being completely true, but I do remember in a lot of the books, there was a lot of talk about how the races interacted with each other. I know as far as some of the racial stuff goes, the Drow was always a big sticking point for people.
More in the cosplay scene.
Yeah, in the cosplay scene.
Blackface.
So, yeah. So that was, the Drow have always been a big sticking point. I think you're going to I think that's why Tieflings are the new Drow. I say it all the time, Tieflings are the new Drow. But because they're more purple, I guess you can get away with it. I don't know. It depends on how dark a purple I guess you go with. But I guess they're blue and purple, so everyone's like, hey, you can blue and purple up all you want to. Just, I don't know. To me, those are areas I don't personally delve into much. So
it gets I mean, there's reasons for why those become issues. A purple person's not going to be an issue because there's no real life purple people that have had a history of being oppressed and all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
Now with Shadowrun, I think you run into some particular situations like human trafficking, drugs, probably sex trade could also be lumped in the same sentence as human trafficking. Violence, our culture is pretty muted on. We see violence in commercials. We don't pay attention anymore. But some of these other things are very touchy, and they're kind of staples of the game setting. Like the evil, Monsanto kind of company, putting drugs in the tap water and that kind of stuff. And a lot of times your character is doing that.
Yeah, it's definitely something that you have to be careful what you're looking for, because again, all of those are very, very predominant throughout the sixth world, or wherever you want to call now. But I think it's definitely a dangerous game you play with it. But I think it again is one of those things where a lot of, and it's so sad to say, but a lot of it we're just sort of immune to. We hear about it on the news so much and stuff like this that you hear about in a game, or you don't really register on an emotional level for it at all, unless you have had that happen to you, or someone's had it happen to you. You're very active about it, but I think it's definitely something that's there. Those kind of things I've tried to stay away from on stream. I've ran with those kind of things as runs in the private sessions, or text message or in game, but it's one of those things I'm still hesitant on running on live air, and I don't know if I ever will, because again, it's one of those situations where I don't know X, Y, or Z in my chat, and if they've had anything that deal with it. So it's one of those things that I'm scared to do, but at the same time, I think it could be an eye-opening fact, like, hey, this does exist in the world, and we're not just hiding about it that it doesn't exist type thing. So I think it could go either way again.
Yeah, so Shadzar is talking to me specifically over there, and I'm Rain Survives, by the way. So he was saying that, we kind of touched on it, that representation in the games with black characters, or he was saying that or he or she or they, I don't know which, was mentioning that, seeing a character that was being beaten by a white character would be kind of a taboo kind of image, if that was your only one. But I think it's about consistency in how you're doing something. Like, you can show that scene, but it can't be the only time you see a black character, right?
Right.
Like, you have to have like a plethora of characters that are of different types, different personalities. I think George R.R. Martin was talking about this the other day in one of the interviews I watched. He was saying, I have lots of women in my stories. Some of them are brave, some of them are cowards, some of them are, strong, some of them are weak, some of them, are in different roles. And I think when you have that, it gives you more of a license to kind of play around with different ideas. But again, if you only have a couple examples, what you do with those examples says a lot, Right. And if it's something negative, man, that's not good. So I think that's where it gets in a little tricky. And I think companies like TSR in the early days probably didn't quite know what that line was or how to tackle it, and probably didn't see a market share that was substantial enough to think that they should afford it.
Once upon a time, and sometimes even still today, things were made with the intent that it was only going to get shoved in front of one half of the populace.
Yeah,
this was a product for men, and we're going to put that commercial on ESPN 500 times a day, and you will never see it anywhere else. And then here's these other things, and we're going to put it on the daytime soap operas, and that's where this commercial is going to run, and the guys will never know it exists. Like, I think that it fell into that trap early on. Like, it was created by a guy and was like, hey, the other guys are going to love this. Like, women will have no interest in this at all. So here, we'll just put that out there this way. And I think that's how it started. And I think it's obviously picked up a lot differently over the course of time. And now you've got like huge populations of women that play D&D, like compared to probably what there used to be. And all these other walks of life people now too are playing as well. So, there's the new slogan is D&D is for everyone. And I agree it's true. And I think nowadays, though, with that, you do have to be, I think people out there developing games and putting together books and stuff are far more cognitive of how that looks when you flip through their book versus some of those old editions you'd pick up from 30 years ago.
Let's see. That's called demographics. And Brie Larson touched on it last year. Things are made for only certain people. Yeah, and I think it comes down to also who's creating the material, like you were saying. Like, an all male group of writers is going to write what they know. Just like we tried to voice female characters the other day in our one episode. Like, that's not our wheelhouse. Like, we don't really know how to do that effectively.
Right. Shadzar is talking, like, he's saying, like, he doesn't. This is something I've been seeing more and more, like, where they don't want to know what a 40-year-old white dude thinks of A Wrinkle in Time. They want to know what a woman of color thinks about it. You know, and I think that's what we're seeing more and more is like, I think what the push isn't so much to have representation be out there in the form of like, what are me and you doing with X, Y, or Z? They're wanting those people to tell those stories. They want to see, you know, people of color as DMs telling these stories, not some white dude telling these stories. I think that's what we're seeing more and more of push for. And I think that's good. I think that needs to be out there. Just to run off what Sheds are saying in the chat at the moment.
Yeah, I think you get different stories. And, you know, as the gaming community becomes more robust and more diverse, you know, we're going to get different types of stories, different ways of telling those stories, different characters in those stories, different themes, different, and like I said, you know, it kind of goes around to the table. But since we're online, we're doing this show, a lot of us are doing our shows on a stream, you know, our stories are going to be different than what those stories are going to be. And I'm looking forward to seeing more stories that I wouldn't necessarily think to tell, you know?
Right.
And I think you get that by, you know, kind of opening it up and leaving room for people.
Yeah. I mean, this is a bad time to probably tell him that you're Hispanic, Jeff.
Yeah. 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 It's all good. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, it's the internet. Sometimes it gets a little touchy out there, but, yeah, I think, again, these topical conversation pieces, you know, writing the themes of the world, there's a lot of places to explore and there's a lot of places to screw up. And I guess that's why I brought up the topic.
For sure.
You know, and it's a tricky tightrope.
And my advice to anybody is tread with caution. Know your players, know your table, know your audience, and tread with caution is what I would say.
Yeah.
Because it's 2019. If 2019 is anything, it is unforgiving.
Unbelievably true.
If there's anything you need to know about 2019, it's unforgiving. So tread with caution if you're going to head into those kind of murky waters.
Well, we're hitting the hour and 50-minute mark here.
It's about time to wrap this up. So
I would say so.
JBrews, why don't you kick us off and tell all the good people out there where they can find you?
Yeah, so I pretty much stream daily besides on Sundays at twitch.tv/JBrews. We'll play a lot of League of Legends, but we do quite a bit of tabletop stuff on Thursdays and Fridays. Thursdays are going to be my game on the channel. And then over on Mod20, twitch.tv/Mod20Gaming, I will be doing that Shadowrun game over there as well. So it'll be a good time. All of them on there, Mod20 Gaming have never played Shadowrun, so it'll be very interesting to see what a fresh group of runners are going to do. So
nice. It sounds like a good time for new people to the game to come in and learn the system with them.
Yes, exactly.
That's fantastic. Dustin, where can we find you?
Well, most of the time you'll find me here on TT2KB playing Bower and Harros in our Everstorm game. I believe the next game is June 22nd.
22nd sounds right to me. Yeah.
22nd sounds right to me without looking at the schedule. So that's in a couple of weeks when our DM gets back from Greece. We will be playing another installment of Everstorm. You'll also find me here on the Wisdom Check every Monday, where we talk about all sorts of different good things revolving around tabletop RPGs. And when I'm not here, occasionally you may find me over at Plague State on Twitch and on Twitter, where I will soon have a few videos and announcements to make over there. So if you are following me there, you should.
Awesome.
Jeff?
And then for myself, you can find me on YouTube at Rain Survives. I do Let's Play content, typically of absurdly difficult gameplay. And if you like to watch somebody bash their head into a wall until success eventually comes, hopefully, that's my kind of content. So you'll also find me playing in the Everstorm game with Dustin here. I play Skeezer, the Gnome Illusionist, and have a fun, wacky voice for that one. So again, come join us on that game on the 22nd. We'll love to have you there. And what are we doing next week? What's the next topics and guests?
Oh, you want me to tell you who's here next week?
Promo? Yeah.
I messed this up earlier today when I was talking to people, so I make sure I got it right. All right, next week, June 17th, Lindy from Laugh Love Lindy will be here. Also a member, I believe, of Encounter Roleplay. So she will be here. And our first topic for next week is going to be tips for getting into character. So
nice.
we're going to talk a little bit. She's a fantastic role player. If you don't check out Lindy, she is on our Discord, and she is on the stream calendar that I put out there. So you can check her out. I know on Mondays and on Tuesdays, she runs a couple different games. And I saw on Friday or Saturday, she actually has another game that she had put out there, which was the new Alien system. So it was kind of cool to get to check in on that. I believe that was on Friday. So I'll have to ask her if that's a regular thing or if it was a one shot. But she does a lot of great characters, so it'll be a really good conversation.
So you got that to look forward to next week. And if you've missed any of our episodes up to this point, we do have a YouTube channel for Tabletop to Keyboard. It's TT2KB. And I've cut all the episodes into 2 chunks, so you can go through and you can watch them at your leisure. And I hope you do. That'd be great.
You go down there on the panels, it says find us on YouTube. You click that big TT2KB thing, and boom, you're there.
Awesome.
That's all you got to do.
Well, guys, thanks so much. Appreciate you all coming and sharing this conversation with us. Thank you, JBrews. Appreciate
Thanks
you.
to all of you out there in the chat, keeping it alive.
Absolutely. It was very chatty tonight. It was nice. And we'll see you next Monday.